Is Sonic Frontiers best on the Nintendo Switch, or are you better off getting it on another platform? We're going to pit the Nintendo Switch version against the current gen consoles and the PC version running on Steam Deck. Sonic Frontiers is a brand new open-world Sonic the Hedgehog game from the Sonic team. In this newest entry of the Sonic franchise, after getting separated from your friends, you play as everyone's favorite blue hedgehog, Sonic, as you explore the mysterious Starfall Islands and collect the Chaos Emeralds. Will the Switch version go the extra miles, or will this be a tale of disappointment? Let's knuckle down and start the comparison. When we first saw gameplay of this title at the Partner Showcase Nintendo Direct, I was surprised how it looked. But yeah, you could tell it was on the Switch. Let's look closely at what makes the Switch version by going over the graphics. Surprisingly, the textures are good, but since the resolution is lower, the overall graphics aren't nearly as good. Everything is lower resolution, and it just kinda looks blurry. In fact, I'm surprised to know that this game actually runs at 720p most of the time. In the cyber levels, it looks best most likely because the levels are smaller and has less elements to generate. When you are actually in a level, it looks good and smoother at a high resolution for the Switch. But when you get into the massive overworld, the dynamic resolution goes right down to 540p-ish, and absolutely tanks in handheld, but we'll come back to that. The depth in the rocks and grass textures are actually great once they load in, because the huge problem with this game is the amount of pop-in, and that's not just the Switch version, it's with every version. Switch, PS5, and the Steam Deck. This is a really odd thing to have so noticeable in a high-speed, open-world game where you gotta go fast. And I get that there's always some degree of pop-in with these kind of games, but this is just too obvious. The Switch has the worst case of pop-in of all three, with the draw distance being significantly shorter. This is extremely noticeable with the grass, foliage, and rocks, but it also affects things like the mountains and structures in the close distance. Like when I'm crossing this bridge, it's really apparent. It looks like the rocks have completely changed formation. Something they could have done was add some sort of effect that makes it a part of the game, like it glitching in since that effect was used elsewhere in the game. Or even if it was just a fade in, that would have helped a lot. The pop-in makes this game feel half-baked and difficult to play, and it's by far the most noticeable issue that this game has. It gets better later on when there's less stuff to pop in, but it's really horrendous here. In fact, it may even affect your gameplay, like when I was tasked to clear this grass field. It was hard to know where the grass even was, or where it extended to. So when you're just running around and you see random stuff spawn, it's so jarring. And some elements are worse than others, like shadows appearing after some items, or not at all. Or these flowers, they're spawning in the game behind Sonic. I'm running through the field and they show up. A little too late. It would have been better to just completely cut them, because that's just horrible. It's also very noticeable in cutscenes. All these cutscenes are in-engine renders, so it's all rendering when you play. It's not pre-rendered to save storage on the Switch. Changing from scene to scene, foliage and textures randomly appear a tad too late. I get that there's a lot of cutscenes, but it would have been awesome to see the classic pre-rendered cutscenes like the previous generation of Sonic games had. Those old cutscenes look so much better than any of these, and they were all from over 10 years ago. But now let's look at one of the most apparent differences. The frame rate. Yeah, Sonic Frontiers is running at 30 frames per second on the Switch, which is a very noticeable drop, especially compared to the PS5, 60 frames per second. This is covered up decently with a tiny bit of motion blur, but still. This game looks and feels great in 60 frames per second, especially because it's supposed to be fast. Supersonic fast. That's the whole point. They didn't call him Slow the Hedgehog, and the game just feels so much faster on the PS5's 60 frames per second. Although it's not terrible at 30 on the Switch, I would definitely prefer 60 for this title. So that's something to know. Everything feels slower on the Switch version because of the frame rate and the load times. The load times aren't actually that long, and they're actually quite fast on the Switch, but the PS5 is obviously just a little faster. Now the lighting and colors. The Switch version has some overall washed out look, but most of the lighting effects are there, like shadows. The shadows are surprisingly sharp on the Switch version too. The trees and enemies even have them, but the PS5 version has much sharper shadows. But again, it's mostly the resolution that makes them that different. Something else that I've noticed about the amount of foliage, there's a huge decrease in grass and plants on the Switch. Side by side, you'll see how filled the PS5 version looks and how empty the Switch version looks. Even distant trees aren't noticeable on the Switch version, and they only show up once you get closer to them. When Sonic hits things, there's noticeably less particles, and just in general there's less objects, like hitting the stacked rocks. On the Switch version, if you hit these rocks, you'll see them disintegrate into thin air, but on the other versions, you'll actually see every rock tumble to the ground. They've obviously done this to cut down on the amount of things that's going on at once for the Switch's hardware, but it looks odd having them just disappear like that. Going back to the particles, you can see a big difference just from when Sonic loads in and out of cyberspace levels. And I was even surprised to see the reflections in this game. Although the reflections in the Switch version are a little less clear, it's great to see them included at all. It's obvious that it's not as good as the PS5 version, but it's there. And it's a similar case with the water effects. But the water effect, where the water splits apart, isn't even on the Switch. But of course, what about playing this game handheld? and now I understand why they call him the Blue Blur. This is a different experience and really makes me reconsider the other versions because this game easily dips right down to 480p handheld, maybe even lower. And the pop-in distance is seemingly even closer because when I'm running around in handheld, it feels like I get caught off guard a little more. And because the resolution is even lower, it feels like the textures have taken even more of a hit. Well, it's still mostly stable, but I found playing this game handheld, it hitches every once in a while. But if you play on the Switch OLED, you might prefer the way the game looks on the screen as well, which makes this game feel so much more vibrant even though it has a rather pale color palette. This game feels the best experience in dock mode though, so if you are planning on playing this purely handheld, you might want to reconsider because the graphics in handheld really make me take a step back. A supersonic step back. Now comparing it to another handheld system, the PC version on Steam Deck is another way to play this game on the go. But it's worth noting, since this game just came out, it isn't verified by Steam to be great on deck yet, although I'm sure it'll get the green checkmark rather soon. But because it's not quite optimized for the Steam Deck yet, it has a few glitchy things going on when I booted it up on launch day, like an odd lighting flicker when I was in 60 frames per second mode. But in the meantime, you can reduce this by locking it to 30 frames per second in the game's settings. But I'll give it some credit. It ran pretty good on low settings at 30 frames per second, with some major spikes. But once their issues are sorted out and it passes Valve's verification system, I'm sure it'll run closer to 40 frames per second with ease, because that's around what I was getting it with all the glitches at 720p. And playing the game handheld on the Steam Deck feels more sturdy and customizable than the Switch. The main problem I had with this version is the input latency. The Steam Deck version seemed to have a weird amount of latency, especially compared to the Switch version, which was running at the same frame rate. So I would hold off on the Steam Deck version until it gets that fun little check mark. Now the controls. The controls are fine on the Switch. While playing the game handheld, it works wonderfully. Obviously the Switch isn't the most comfortable system long term, with the Joy-Cons especially when compared to the Steam Deck, but it does the job. Once you connect your Pro controller to the system, it's great. And for the Switch Lite users, same goes for you. If you like how the Switch feels, then it works. So the controls are good, but I just found it really difficult to get used to playing as Sonic, especially while I was still learning the controls. It felt really awesome times when you're running up the side of an enemy and it feels like I did some random inputs. Like when I jump off a spring or try to dash or jump, you can lose all the momentum and fall to the ground, then have to climb all the way back up. And it feels very janky when Sonic randomly takes jumps and everything gets thrown off. This was very noticeable, especially when I was fighting. I think fighting is the most difficult thing to get the hang of and learn how to do it properly, but again, I think you just gotta get used to it. Some other nitpicking for all the versions is some weird UI choices, like when going into the settings, you click the settings button, then you click it again. For some reason you get into these sub options. It's kind of weird at first, but eventually you'll know where it is. Or the speedometer. Is Sonic a car now? Maybe I just need to get further into the game. Overall, the game is a great comeback for Sonic. Much better than the last few. And it seems to be paving the way for an even better game. And I say that because although this game is great, and it's far better than the previous games, it lacks some polish and needs just a bit more care. But aside from this, the game is great, and was ported very good to the Switch. Though to answer the main question, is it best on Switch? Well, in this game, especially a Sonic game, you'll want to move at a higher frame rate to feel like you're moving supersonic style. So while this port on Switch is good, it doesn't feel or look nearly as good to play. And because it tanks in handheld, which would be the whole reason to get the Switch version if you own other consoles, it's harder to recommend. The PS5 or Xbox is a better TV console experience, but if you don't mind playing in 30 frames per second, or even prefer it, then you can just go get the Switch version. But if you want a higher frame rate and resolution, then it's not best on Switch. But of course, if the Switch is your only option, it's completely playable and I think you'll still enjoy it. So let me know, have you played Sonic Frontiers? Are you planning on getting it on Switch? Are you planning on getting it on another console? Or if you have it on another console, or if you have it on the Switch, let me know what you think about it and if you regret that decision or not. But please, consider subscribing if you like this video, and like the video if you like this video. I hope to see you in the next one. See you later.